There's nothing in there that is not from the very essence and the heart, the living core of authentic spiritual Islam. That's his message. And the reason why it's so powerful as a message is that his sincerity allowed him the idhn, the permission from his Lord, to have a deep insight into the Quran and the Hadith, to see what they were really for. And he became angry with nobody so much as he became angry with his colleagues, the ulama. He becomes angry with the Ismailis, and he becomes angry with the Arab philosophers and many other categories. He is a warrior, he's a mujahid of the mind, but the people for whom he reserves his unconditional scorn are many of the ulama themselves. Ulama al-Rusum, the scholars of outward form. Because these are the people who are doing the great unpardonable error of using Allah's signs, which are there as rahmatun wa shifa, as a mercy and a healing, and using them in order to justify their own egotistic claims about themselves. Showing off, strutting their stuff in front of wealthy sultans, hoping for a bag of gold when they have successfully concluded a debate with some other scholar. So he has this book, Dhamm al-Ghurur, in the Ihya, where he pulls no punches, the condemnation of vainglory. The scholar who knows the Quran and the Hadith back to front and can quote you any last obscure issue in fiqh or in mantiq or in tafsir, but it's all to do with the ego, the nafs. What could be more ugly than that? Imam al-Ghazali is angry with those people. And that sincerity in his book, which is that the ugliest thing that we can do is to take Allah's signs and use them as a way of propping up our ego, our lower selves, rather than becoming more humble and more loving and more open towards others. That's the great energy of Imam al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin, and that's the reason why it continues to reach out at a distance of more than 900 years, which is a long time, and from such a very different place to affect our souls today. Which is why I continue to receive letters from people who have picked up translations of the Ihya Ulumuddin, telling me what a difference these books have made to their lives. Recently, for instance, a lady wrote to me saying, I had always intended to wear the hijab, but I thought I would wait until I'd done my Hajj when I would feel strong enough to do it, because in England it's difficult. When I read Imam al-Ghazali on remembering death, I realized that that again was just from the nafs, and I put it on immediately, and inshallah I won't take it off until the day I die. That's the power of the man. We find it difficult to make a real impact on people who we might know really well and who are from our own culture. We find it hard to communicate with other human beings. It is a mystery how it is that the qualities of souls osmotically transfer themselves from each human space to other human spaces. But Imam al-Ghazali manages to do it at that great distance of 1,000 years, coming from Seljuk, Baghdad and Central Asia, and a kind of world that we would find extraordinarily unfamiliar if we could hop into a time machine and experience it. But still, what he says is so powerful and so universal that it makes us strong enough to put on the hijab, or it makes us strong enough to convert to Islam. It is an extraordinary thing, an alchemy of the heart, the alchemy of happiness, as he calls it. Kimya-i sa'ada. It's a kind of miraculous formula that he has found. But the ingredients are the same ingredients. It's Quran and Hadith. That is what we need. But what we need in terms of the interpretation of those things is sincerity and humility and an awareness of the alternative. Imam al-Ghazali was not just a man who theorized about tawbah and repentance, but he was a man who experienced it in his own life in a particularly traumatic way. And if you scan the pages of the history of world religions, you will be hard put to find somebody who went through such inner traumas as Imam al-Ghazali did. He himself experienced the sin of vainglory as a scholar. He was the leading professor in the Islamic world of his day, appointed by Nizam al-Mulk, probably the most powerful man in the world, teaching in Baghdad, at the time the biggest city in the world. He had hundreds of adoring, brilliant students at his feet. And despite all of that, the great humiliation of having to leave his job. of being struck dumb in the middle of a lecture in the great mosque and having to leave. A complete crushing of the ego. But why did that take place? Because despite everything, the fitra was still active. And we need to remember that. Whenever we are judgmental about somebody else and look at how ugly somebody might be when they misbehave, they treat their wife badly, they take a bribe, they're always cursing people, they neglect their children, whatever ugly things they may do or we may do, the fitra is still there. There's still a good human being deep down that can come to the surface. Imam al-Ghazali had fallen prey to the great sin, and he identifies it as such, of using religion for his own vainglory. He was afraid of that, and that little maggot of doubt grew and grew until eventually it caused his metabolism to break down. His spiritual circuits fused and he had to leave. Perhaps the greatest tawbah, the greatest repentance in history. And as a result of that, experiencing himself those traumas, he was able to write this book that uniquely is able to magnetize our hearts and to transform us. I never cease to be amazed by the impact that the Imam can have on people whose culture and temperament and religious orientation would have been utterly unimaginable to somebody from his time and his place. Particularly when we deal with new Muslims, and despite the negative media coverage of Islam in the West, we have never had more converts to Islam than we are having at the moment. And constantly, even in my own little town of Cambridge, there are people who are contacting us and asking for admission. Just yesterday, a Brazilian priest contacted me and said that he wanted to take Shahada. These people just are magnetized by the beauty of Islam, despite the ugliness of so many Muslims. The power of the light of Islam still manages to shine. And the thing that we find most helpful for those people, that really speaks to their own state of transformation, of moving from one religious world to another, their own state of tawbah, is the power of the works of Imam al-Ghazali. Now, that's one reason why we decided that we had to allow the Imam to speak with a new voice. There have been translations for many years of many of his key works. But the Ihya Ulumuddin, when you think about it, is 40 volumes. How many of us have ever read a book that has 40 volumes? I certainly haven't. Sometimes we might dip into an encyclopedia and look something up and then put it back on the shelf, and it stays there for another 20 years until somebody else takes it off. But he was from a world where they didn't have word processors, they didn't have Blackberries, they didn't have all of these amazing ways that we have now of producing text. But he managed to write this gigantic book, and a book in whose every page there is some alchemical transformation for the readers. There is no page that you want to turn over in a hurry, because everything there is really relevant to you. There's a lot of niyyah as well as religious intelligence in the book. So what can we do when we have all of these people becoming Muslim now in England, and we find Imam al-Ghazali is enormously helpful in strengthening their faith, in speaking to their condition, in sustaining them in sometimes very difficult situations? Well, what we have is the possibility of using new technologies and new media and a new platform in order to make the medicine more widely available. And that medicine is the same. It's whatever it was when Imam al-Ghazali originally had it inspired into his heart. But these new digital technologies have to be used by the Muslims. It's not an age in which we can simply sit back and say, we won't use that new technology. And after all, it is not new that a new technology should have caused us to furrow our brows and scratch our heads. If you look at the issues that the ulama raised when printing was invented, and the consequences for the sacredness of the written text, when no longer was every little dot and dash that you read written by a scribe who was doing it fi sabilillah, who had been trained by other scribes who were part of a whole sacred vision of what it was to produce a text, but instead was produced by some machine that could churn out 1,000 of them in a day. The ulama were very worried about the consequences of that for our form of religion, which after all is based on the word. Iqra is the beginning of